Hi, everyone. Welcome to the inaugural episode of Bay Nature Talks. I'm Victoria Schlesinger, the editor of Bay Nature magazine and website. And I'm here today with Zach St. George, who is the author of the brand new book, The Journeys of Trees, published by Norton and Company, and it came out just last week. Before we get into our conversation, I'm going to cover a few logistics for everybody. We're going to be talking for about 40 minutes. And then at the last 20 minutes of our hours, you'll have a chance to get your questions answered, but feel free to send in your questions via Zoom's Q&A function at any point, and then we'll get to them at the end, as many as we can. Also, please don't use that Zoom Q&A function to ask us any technical questions, because unfortunately, we can't help you. We are small and also learning how to use Zoom. So, but if for some unfortunate reason you can't view this program live, we are going to send a link out tomorrow. This will all be recorded, and so you'll have that in your inbox tomorrow and you can watch it then. So Bay Nature magazine, if you're not familiar with it, is an independent nonprofit magazine and website that covers the environment and nature in the greater Bay Area. We're in our 20th year of publishing now. Our summer issue here, hope that works, has a story by Zach St. George. It's an excerpt from his book, The Journeys of Trees, about Monterey Pines, and we'll be talking about that. If you would like to subscribe to Bay Nature, go to our website, baynature.org, and use the promotional code BNTalks, and you'll get a $5 discount. The other supporting organization here is Point Reyes Books, which is an independent bookstore in West Marin, Point Reyes Station. You can buy Zach's book through Point Reyes Books. The Journey of Trees. Also there in, I know, I've got my original.
You got the updated version here.
Yeah, there we go. You can go to their homepage, Point Reyes Books homepage. It's ptreysbooks.com. You can also go to the store in person because they are now open. And while you're there, may I encourage you to get your special edition t-shirt. My family and I all have ours, sold only at Point Reyes Books, and it supports them in all independent bookstores. So with all that out of the way, let's dive in, Zach. So Zach originally comes from Alaska, and somewhere along the way got his degree in journalism from University of California, Berkeley. He has published magazine features in The Atlantic, Scientific American, Outside, and of course, Bay Nature. We've published several of his features over the years. Most memorably, he wrote about the flammability of eucalyptus trees in the fall of 2016. That story went on to win an award from the Society of Professional Journalists of Northern California for best science writing. He's also more recently wrote about the Tubbs, Atlas, and Nuns fire right after they happened in 2017 for Bay Nature. And then, of course, this summer, he's got his adaptation from the book about Monterey Pines. You were telling me, Zach, that it was about 5 years ago that this initial idea crossed your path, the idea being that trees can be in the wrong place. And that idea sent you on this journey, this book journey. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, and yeah, I want to say too, I can see there's a bunch of people watching. So, you know, I know Tuesday afternoons aren't what they used to be, but thank you, I appreciate it. So yeah, the book came about. I learned in the fall of 2014, I read a news article about the giant sequoias in Sequoia National Park. Were losing their needles, and it was something that the scientists at the park had never seen before. It was something there seemed to be no records of happening before. So I went up there and went on a survey with the US Geological Survey scientists who were kind of tracking how much of the crowns of these trees had died. And it kind of represented this, this moment where they were looking at these giant iconic trees, and you know, the conservation had very much been focused on keeping the trees as they were, keeping them healthy where they were. But they were viewing this drought, which was causing the trees to lose their needles, as kind of a possible preview of a warmer future. And so, you know, they're beginning to think about kind of, okay, you know, maybe if this continues to happen, maybe Sequoia National Park will not be able to support these trees. Maybe this won't be the place for them anymore. And so they're beginning to think about the future of the species more generally, and like, you know, where do sequoias want to go in the warmer future? And so it led me to this question that kind of starts the book, which is, you know, should people move trees north or upslope as a way to save them from climate change? And that goes directly in the face of how we've done conservation for the past 100 years, trying to keep things basically where they're at. And so it just opened this door that drew me in.
So tell us a little bit, since most people haven't had the opportunity to get their hands on your book yet, just sort of how the book is structured and how you move us through the information that starts with that question.
Yeah, so basically I focus on 5 species: giant sequoia, black spruce, which is a dominant tree in the boreal forest of North America, Monterey Pine, which is local there in California, ash trees, which there's actually 16 different species, but I took them as a group because they're facing the same problem. 16 species in North America. And then this very rare conifer called the Florida Torreya. And they each kind of represented different pieces of this question. This question again of, should we move trees north as a conservation method? And why I picked those 5 trees, it's a little bit arbitrary. It was, you know, logistics. What could I reasonably get to see? What was I interested in? But basically each of them is answering kind of a different piece of the question. So giant sequoias, that's a way of getting out, you know, why is this species distributed the way it is in the present? Black spruce was kind of a way of looking at the question of where have species been distributed in the past. Monterey Pine is kind of about where humans come into the story, and there's this experiment of, you know, if you move things around, where can they live? Where can they thrive? Ash trees tell the story of mistakes when we move species around and cause terrible damage, as it turns out. And then the Florida Torreya is kind of the story of, you know, we're looking at a changing world. We're trying to intervene, and is the risk worth the reward? So, yeah.
Okay, so tell us then more. I mean, the story of the Monterey Pine is so great, and it involves David Douglas, who's revered by many in the plant world. So tell us tell us about Monterey Pine, and tell us how those seeds first got to Europe and then what happened. Yeah,
so I kind of told the story both in the book and then for Bay Nature of the Monterey Pine which is kind of this classic story. It's really a perfect example of a species that people have really altered the course of its history. They've sort of picked up this rare tree and scattered it all over the world. David Douglas is the namesake of Douglas fir is named after him. He was, he was this young, exploring, wandering botanist, is how I described him. From the early 1800s, he traveled. He made a few trips to North America, to the Pacific Northwest. He spent a bunch of time in the San Francisco Bay area and Monterey Bay, and he's really kind of the archetype of this era of exploration with primarily white male Europeans traveling around the world, gathering up everything that they can find, and sort of just distributing it and seeing where it'll grow.
And so, was that their primary question? Was that one of their goals, is just, will it grow here? How about I try it?
Yeah, I mean, there was a few pieces. I mean, they were in the era of kind of exploration and naming things according to the Linnaean, genus and species hierarchy. But there was definitely a commercial aspect. Douglas worked for basically a greenhouse that in Europe, it was a fad to plant species from all over the world. So wealthy people would have these huge gardens and just plant everything. But then there was also, kind of an industrial side to it. Like, there was basically plants. One botanist put it to me, were the technology of their day, which they're kind of the technology of our day too, to be fair.
Yeah.
But yeah, so one of the central questions of science at that point was, if we take this species from over here and plant it over here, what will happen?
Mm-hmm. Okay, and so tell us what, well, first of all, you've got to say just a little bit about David Douglas and his sort of unusual life.
Travails of David Douglas. So David Douglas was from Scotland. He was interested in botany from a young age. He kind of worked his way up through the botanical gardens of the British Isles. And he's been written about a lot. There's been books about him, because he was just kind of this classic adventure type, and then he was also very prolific. So he introduced hundreds and hundreds of species to the UK before he died. The thing I thought was so interesting going through his journals, because the journals are all available now, and the thing that hadn't really been written about was what a terrible time he had. He just got beaten up constantly. He almost froze to death so many times it just starts to get boring. And then he met a pretty terrible end in Hawaii. So I just
wonder what species were lost during his travails. I mean, in your descriptions from the journals, it sounds like, I mean, he just had so many accidents and encounters with wildlife that just consumed his seed collections that you wonder what else might have been brought to Europe if he hadn't had all those catastrophes.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's hard to know. I mean, the good news is that plenty of other people were doing the same thing, both before and after him. But yeah, I mean, so I just found him to be a really good example of that time period, which has left us with a legacy where we can, walk down the streets of San Francisco and find plants from, 5 continents growing side by side. So the Monterey Pine is a good example of that species that's gotten moved, though. It grows in 5 small groves in the wild, 1 in Monterey, a couple more on the California coast, 2 off the coast of Baja. Very rare, and kind of from a long-term point of view, things didn't look very good for it. It's just severely limited in its range. Along came Douglas and other explorers, took its seed first to Europe, primarily the UK, and then it went to New Zealand, South Africa, Australia, and then eventually South America and elsewhere. And now it is one of the most widely planted trees in the world. I mean, it's, I think it grows over 500 times as much land as it did in the wild. And primarily as lumber. Yeah, so it's a commercial species. It turned out it does really well in the Southern Hemisphere as a commercial species. So it's this tree that's had fantastic success. It's a great example of how we've really altered the trajectory of whole species just by moving them around the world, allowing them to get to places they never would have gotten on their own. Yeah. Well,
and what I like in your Bay Nature article is that you really talked about the tension there between a species in the wild and the genetic diversity of that species in the case of Monterey Pine, and then how is it both the same species and a very different species when grown commercially worldwide, and what are the tensions and issues around that?
Yeah, I mean, when conservationists, modern conservationists kind of know that a species is the sum of its genes. So you're trying to keep both the entire genetic diversity of a species and also the kind of odd little populations. So you're trying to preserve both those kind of unique things. The explorers like David Douglas, who kind of scattered the seeds that would eventually become these vast commercial forests or plantations. They weren't thinking about that. They were kind of viewing species as kind of a stamp collection mentality. So like one of everything is kind of good enough. So you wind up with these potentially kind of non-representative bits and pieces of the species genome as a whole, and so you wind up in an odd place from a conservation point of view.
So the Monterey Pine, along with many of the other trees that you talk about in the book, each of the chapters sort of pivots around this question. I'm going to read it to make sure I get the wording right, but why things live where they do and not where they don't. And that's this question that biogeographers ask, and it's a question throughout your book. And can you talk a little bit about why we should be asking that question today?
Yeah, so biogeography is to put it very broadly the study of basically the arrangement of the world's living things. Both why are they arranged the way they are, and how did they get to be arranged the way they are. So I put it, I kind of put the question as, why are things where they are and not where they're not. And so it's an important question because as we move the world species around, as the climate changes, which has always forced species to move and adapt, when we think about what the arrangement's going to be in the future, whether it's an arrangement we like, whether it satisfies, cultural or economic or, ecological values, and when we think about if we want to intervene in instances, if we want to try to move species to where we think they ought to be or where they'll do better in the future, we really have to think about why are they in the places they're present, and why are they absent from places that they're not.
Yeah. I'm going to jump a little bit, but I want you to talk about you talk about those 5 species, but you also talk about the American chestnut, and I think it's sort of it would be great if you could tell that story and what that story means for other species as we start to think about where they grow and why do they grow there. And if they're no longer growing where we want them to grow, what does the American chestnut teach us?
Right. Yeah, I mean, so one of the kind of oldest stories in the biological sciences is the story of unintended consequences. And often how that story, the form it takes is that, humans move some species to a new place and it sort of escapes from our control, if ever we had any control, and ends up rearranging other species. And so the story of the American chestnut is that in the early 1900s, a tree, an American chestnut in the Bronx Zoo, came down with this blight. It got this fungus. At that point, American chestnuts, they were just massive, massive trees. They were, I think, the biggest trees east of the Mississippi. They were huge. They were very common. People all up and down Appalachia, all the way up in New Hampshire, would gather the chestnuts every year and roast them on open fires or whatever. But anyway, they were this well-known, beloved tree, and basically what happened is they all died out after this blight was discovered. It spread very quickly. They eventually traced it back to it was a fungus that had been carried over into North America it was native to a relative of the American chestnut from Eastern Asia. So the American chestnuts did not have any resistance, and they were pretty much all wiped out. So for the last 50 some years, scientists have been trying to bring this tree back because it was so beloved. The ecosystems that it was a part of are completely rearranged. The animals that were
their absence or a combination of forces.
Well, yeah, I mean, probably a combination, but the fact, I mean, this was a central species in these ecosystems and it just disappeared. So, hemlock in certain cases became dominant. You just had this complete rearrangement. But we love this species so much that we've spent 50 years trying to breed a blight-resistant chestnut. And we're getting there. We're getting close to having a chestnut that is blight resistant and basically looks and acts like an American chestnut. I think.
Am I getting this right that you said it was like 1/15? Was that the right?
Yeah. So what they did is they bred it with a Manchurian chestnut, which conferred some of the resistance, but basically kept the physical form of the tree. The blight resistance, and preserved the look of the thing. And so I visited a site where they're starting to plant out American chestnuts. And it's just an example of, I think there will be instances where we can intervene successfully. Like, I mean, I'm kind of doing air quotes on successful because it depends what you want. If you want an American chestnut, that is, it turns out, something we can recreate. Ecosystems that existed before, all up and down Appalachia, those are gone, and there's kind of no reasonable hope of getting those back.
So how is hybrid doing in its original forest, despite that there have been rearranged?
Yeah, I really only visited it in one site in northern New Hampshire, so I can't speak broadly about kind of the reintroduction of American chestnut. In that case, I was looking at a site where actually it was the Forest Service and a number of other agencies, federal agencies, and I believe even some Canadians had partnered with Dartmouth on one of Dartmouth's holdings in northern New Hampshire.
Right.
And they were planting a forest that was actually kind of more like the forests of southern New Hampshire, so some hundreds of miles south. And they kind of just threw in American chestnut, this resurrected version, just to see how it would do. But kind of the broader point was, they're moving this set of trees, basically creating this suite of trees that closely matches the forests from 100 miles south or 200 miles south, whatever it was, just to see how does that do there?
Yeah.
Does that start to do better than the surrounding forest?
Yeah.
So that's kind of the question of climate change in a kind of a microscopic example of that. And then, is that something we can eventually do on a broad scale? Is it something we would
I can't hold back. I have to ask about Connie Barlow now, who is this character, this person who really becomes a character in the book, throughout the book, and her relationship with the Florida, could you pronounce it for me again? Toria? Okay.
It's actually, it could be Toria too. It's kind of a tomato thing.
Okay, all right, great. So yeah, tell us her story, and because it really, her story to me really has everything to do with how individuals who are really concerned about our environment and are so concerned they are moved to really try to help and even take matters into their own hands. So on the one hand, you have a conglomerate of agencies and universities trying out some of these ideas about moving species forward, and then you have Connie Barlow. So tell us about her.
Yeah, so this tree, the Florida Torea, it's an evergreen tree. It for all of its recorded existence, lived on the bluffs, the limestone bluffs overlooking the Apalachicola River, which is on the Florida Panhandle. It lived in these ravines that kind of cut through the bluffs. It's really narrow kind of set of circumstances that it lived in. But in those circumstances, it was fairly common. And people used it for all sorts of things. And then in the 1950s, this tree started dying off all of a sudden. And again, like with the American chestnut, the issue seemed to be this fungus. And nobody really knew, why now, why this fungus, what's happening. And so, a range of people and agencies did work to preserve the tree, kind of, for the most part, using kind of traditional methods. So, studying it in the wild, trying to reduce human impact in the wild, also collecting and growing individuals in preserves, just in case all of the trees in the wild died out, you'd have some backup. Connie Barlow.
Is it, so just to clarify, is it classified as endangered at this point, federally or at the state level, the tree?
Yeah, it is. It's listed under the Endangered Species Act. Yeah.
Okay.
And I believe it's endangered. I think, yeah, it's endangered. It's not threatened. It's the full listing. But anyway, so Connie Barlow is at that point a science writer. Her and her husband do what they call evolutionary evangelism. They drive around and give talks basically on the religious meaning to be found in kind of a deep acceptance and understanding.
A religious meaning? I mean, like a spiritual.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
All right.
A spiritual, like find your place on Earth through evolution. So anyway, she visits this tree in the early 2000s, and she thinks that the problem is not that this fungus has suddenly turned up. She thinks that the issue is that the tree at the end of the last ice age should have migrated north, and for some reason had not. And so the fungus was kind of a symptom of that climatic mismatch. Like this tree should have been in somewhere further north in the Appalachians.
It didn't get the benefit of a David Douglas moving its seeds north and helping it end up in a place where it would grow.
Right. It did not have that Pleistocene David Douglas that came by and moved it. So she thought that the problem was this this climatic mismatch, and she basically decided to move the species north. And so she got a group of volunteers together, and that's what they did. They got seeds from nurseries and botanical gardens and sent them to volunteers further north. And so people planted them on their private property. And you're right. She, I think, is someone who cares a lot about the world and its inhabitants, and wants to do something and kind of have some meaningful impact, which I think is something which I think is very relatable.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of one of the puzzles of the book is how do we confront these sweeping changes and kind of meaningfully act in the face of seeing that changes are coming. What do we do?
Did you come to any conclusions about her way of getting involved and taking action?
Yeah, so again, that question of whether or not we should move trees north as a conservation method is very controversial. Again, because of this story of unintended consequences, you're kind of presuming, A, why is the species in the place that it's in right now, and B, what will it do when we move it? So you're confronting that story of unintended consequences. That being said, I think that yes, we will at times move species north, and we're already doing that in some cases. Really, the people who are the furthest out ahead on this are, in many cases, foresters who are looking at their bottom line and saying, if we plant the same trees in the same places in the future, it's not going to work. So in Canada already, in several provinces, you legally have to plant seeds from further south or downslope. In effect, planting a tree that is adapted to a warmer climate.
So let me bring up another very controversial issue, which is CRISPR, and you touch on that subject briefly in the case of Connie and her response to that, and another, I believe it was a forester's thinking about CRISPR in the case of the Florida Torreya. So can you talk about that as a future conservation tool, or is that you just touched on it, so don't let me put you too much on the spot, but.
So CRISPR is one of kind of one of the ways that we can directly edit the genome and even swap genes between species. And so despite Connie Barlow's actions to save the Florida Torreya, it has not thus far earned a lot of support in kind of the more established traditional conservation movement. And so the Florida Torreya has continued to decline in the wild. And so maybe 2 years ago now, I guess, some of the scientists involved in its conservation suggested altering its genome to resist this fungus. Connie Barlow is very opposed, thinks that we should be spending the time and money moving the species north. CRISPR, again, it's a little bit like assisted migration. Like, I think you are confronting the question of unintended consequences. Humans have kind of a bad record of tinkering. But basically, we're facing an era of, right now, the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is the highest it's been in 3 million years. Some scientists project that by the middle of this century, it'll be the highest it's been in 50 million years. So we're confronting really vast, sweeping change. When we look at the world's forests, we're going to see a lot of change. When we look at every ecosystem is going to change. So I think having these tools, I think sort of thinking about these tools of assisted migration or CRISPR, I call it assisted evolution.
Chestnut with hybridization over many generations.
Yeah, so I think it's an era when it makes sense to be open to kind of all of the tools, whether they apply broadly or only in very specific instances.
And I know we're actually going to run out of our time soon to just chat. So I want to make sure I want to come full circle here. You started out talking about the sequoia, and the second half of that story is super fascinating about Sierra Pacific. And here's another entity that is beginning to move species north. So tell the story of that.
Yeah, so this is another instance, I mean, where timber companies are being fairly progressive on moving species around in a way that conservationists and particularly government agencies haven't been as willing to do so far. So Sierra Pacific Industries is the biggest timber company in California. It's privately owned. One of their vice presidents maybe 7 or 8 years ago, was at a meeting of giant sequoia grove managers, so the federal, state, and tribal entities that manage the groves, 70-some groves of sequoias. The managers were worried about the future of sequoias in the places that they currently exist, and so they were talking about starting a seed bank in case there's catastrophes in the places where these trees currently exist. Yeah. This forester basically said, well, we are already in the business of planting trees. We have a ton of land. We're already doing this. And so basically they started this genetic conservation project, and they're collecting cones and seeds from each of the 70-some groves and planting duplicate groves north and upslope across their holdings. And the agreement is that they will not; those are not going to become timber trees. Those are preserved in perpetuity. So that's a story I've been following for 5 or 6 years now, I guess.
And are those groves the furthest north of Sequoia? I mean, they're testing it.
Yeah, I mean, again,
what you're saying is this is an experiment of how far north can they survive?
Yeah, and it's not exactly to find the limit of how far these things can go. It's another example of, with David Douglas and people like to experiment. So, there's sequoias growing in Scotland, there's sequoias growing in Turkey. But what this company is doing is very systematic. They're keeping each of the groves kind of in its distinct population. They all have a little bit different genetics. So it's keeping them quite distinct. So I think it's probably the most systematic example of conservation through assisted migration.
Why
so it's not
a huge private company doing this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's something I wondered about a lot. It's kind of what initially interested me. It was like, what are they going to use these sequoias for? It depends who you ask. According to the company, it's altruistic. It's a huge company, and the cost of doing this is not huge. From a cynical point of view, it earns them some points with their neighbors, the federal, state, and tribal managers. It also attracts people like me. So there's kind of some cynical reasons that you could sort of imagine. But, you talk to the people involved, and they all take it pretty seriously and feel pretty good about it. So.
Thanks. I am now scrolling through a few of these questions. We have a bunch of questions, so this is awesome. Here's one that, let's see, from Cheryl. She writes, the American chestnut story sounds very familiar to what is occurring with sudden oak death. Do you look at study sudden oak death? And obviously you're not a scientist, but in your journalism work, have you thought about sudden oak death? I mean, it's a widespread and really serious issue in California.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak very much about sudden oak death. I know a little bit about it from being in the Bay, but I would say basically it's a piece of the same story, which is that we've rearranged the world's living things And often we allow new things. We're basically conducting that experiment that David Douglas was conducting. Mm-hmm. We're seeing, we've moved this thing over here. Will it grow? What will it do? And often in the case of sudden oak death, it's not like we've been very purposeful. We didn't.
No, it's that. I think we're still trying to figure out exactly where that came from, and it's certainly distributed through nurseries and.
Yeah, but I mean, so it's a piece of the same story. And even coronavirus is another example. Honestly, it's we're moving the world's species around, introducing new opportunities for things to thrive in new places, and sometimes there's unintended consequences.
All right, let me see. Dina Roberts asks, what do you think of the idea of planting 1 trillion trees to mitigate global carbon emissions or as offset? What species should be planted? Your book addresses some of this, so.
I do write about this. We should plant all different species. We should think about what species are going to do well in the future in different places. We should not plant monocultures. We should not rely only on trees to save us. We need to reduce emissions to actually stop climate change. Planting trees is great if you do it carefully, but it's not enough by itself. And even the people involved in some of the biggest tree planting.
Say just briefly which efforts you covered in the book.
Yeah, I read about Plant for the People, or Plant for the Planet, sorry. And that was, grew out of an effort by a bunch of German kids back in the 2010s. And it currently is tied to the United Nations, and they've kind of subsumed smaller efforts. So I think to date, they've planted like 13.5 billion trees all over the place.
Cool. Just one nice comment here, among many, but Mary Olivella says, thanks so much for this presentation. Look forward to reading your book. Let's see. Okay. Christine Windham writes, our restoration group works with Friends of Saucil Creek in Joaquin Miller Park in Oakland, your old stomping grounds, to remove invasives and plant natives. We take out what Monterey pine we can. It seems like the Monterey pine has interrupted oak and madrone growth by blocking light. It is also not adapted to have good root relationships with this local tree community. Will this be an issue every time something gets moved into a new ecosystem? That is the question.
I appreciate the question. I'm going to, I can't speak to the specifics of that park. I will say that if you go back not even that long in geological history, if you go back in the ice ages, so really when you're dealing with almost all the species that we currently have were in existence, basically everything would have looked the same, except we're missing some of the big mammals. During the Pleistocene ice ages, Monterey pine traveled up and down the California coast. So one of the proposals that I write about in the book is by a woman named Connie Barlow, Forest Service paleoecologist, who suggests that, look, the Monterey pines are not doing great in their native groves in Monterey and further down the coast. So, people, as they scattered this tree all around the world, we also scattered it up and down the California coast, often in places that it existed in the recent geological past. So
based on that seed bank that was developed in effect overseas and then brought back, or from those native?
Not necessarily. Okay. I mean, I can't answer that directly, but basically we have Monterey pines in places that there used to be Monterey pines. Could we regard those as native neonatives is the name that Millar used. And that's just a shift in perspective. That's not even, we don't have to do anything. We just have to view the trees and say, okay, Joaquin Miller, that's plausible. You know, that's maybe not the worst place for these Monterey pines. It's not like moving something from a different continent.
Right, right. Well, so, and I suspect that there are a number of people like Christine who are involved in conservation projects of sorts. And if they have these kind of, I mean, really specific place-based questions, I mean, where would they go to get those kind of questions answered? Where would you look as a reporter to get some information? Who would you call?
Yeah, that's tough. I mean, there's no central line, you know, you can't, no 800 number. I mean, broadly though, I would say, look at the degree of change we're facing. Look at the fossil record. I mean, I know there's no central line for that either, but basically when the climate changes, the arrangement of species changes too. We cannot keep species in their places if the climate continues to change. We just can't. That's not how it works. It's not how it's ever worked. We'll be able to do it for a certain amount of time, and maybe that's a couple hundred years, who knows. But at a certain point, the climate changes, the arrangement of species changes too. So I think at the very least, we should take a little broader view of where things belong. And we might think about precedent from the Pleistocene, particularly the tail end of the Pleistocene, and realize that where things are today is a snapshot in time.
So I'm going to take just a piece of a question from Marilyn Sarney, but she basically, just to distill her question is, are humans ethically responsible for helping primary species to survive? Which I think gets at what you were just saying.
Yeah, I mean,
is there an ethical angle to this?
I think there's certainly, I mean, I think there is an ethical angle. I am a reporter and ask a lot of people these questions. I can't say that there's one answer. I think it depends who you ask. You know, I think the knowledge that we are, in many cases, culpable, both for habitat destruction and then climate change more indirectly, I think that certainly weighs on each of us in different ways. I can't, so I think, yes, there is an ethical component. What is the answer to that? I'm going to have to defer on that.
Although we did talk before about, you know, that there's a subtle point you're making through this book about assisted migration. And so just distill for me what, I mean, you never really say in the book, yes, we should all be doing this. No, we shouldn't. So just, maybe you're going to be repeating yourself here, but let me just put that pointedly.
Yeah. I mean, so one vision of the future, instead of a bunch of people trying to preserve species where they currently are, Connie Barlow envisions groups of, probably similar to the person who asked the question, envisions people like that, instead picking a favorite species or a favorite ecosystem perhaps, and helping it migrate to places that they'll think it'll be more suitable. So that's one possible vision. Is it the right one? I don't know. I mean, I think, as I said earlier, we need to be open to a new suite of conservation tools, and whether any of those is right in a specific case, I would defer to the experts or people who have more time to figure it out individually and know the area. But I think we need to perhaps be more open to new kinds of intervention than we have been in the past.
We talk about it like we are. Let's see. Okay. Okay, Janet McGarry asks, I'm not sure how you can answer this question, but let's at least bring it up. It seems incredibly difficult for scientists to figure out where trees will thrive in the future when they move them north. Indeed. How do they make decisions about where to plant them? Do they have fear that they are impacting existing ecosystems when they introduce new trees? I would venture that is part of the resistance to the ideas you're talking about.
Yeah, again, it's this question of, does the risk outweigh the reward? Yeah. So for the most part, aside from these kind of isolated instances of either private citizens or a private company moving species and saying, this is just what we're doing, for the most part, in instances where scientists have moved species north or upslope, it's been couched as an experiment. There are ways to kind of get a sense of where something might do well. I mean, there's kind of just the natural history of looking at where do things grow. You can go out and see that, you know, redwoods tend to grow in different places than, you know, they're not on the tops of dry hills, and oaks tend not to be on the dry, you know, the wet valley bottoms. So that can give, I mean, that can give you some idea. The other way is to do what they call niche modeling, which is basically looking more broadly at the distribution of species and kind of overlaying the characteristics of that range with climate models and saying, where is there going to be similar habitat in the future? So that's another way that they do that. Okay,
cool. Great answer. Nancy W. asks about bristlecone pines, which are always a cool species to talk about. She says, I've heard that bristlecone pines are starting to thrive with climate change. Are there any worries on competition there?
It's a great question. I actually write about the bristlecone pines in the book, so I'm glad you brought it up. The interesting thing there, they are starting to see bristlecone pines move up the mountains in Eastern California. The interesting thing there that's maybe a preview of what we can expect from in the future is that the arrangement is not staying the same. It's not just bristlecone pines shifting up the mountain. Instead, you have this other species, limber pine, which is currently tends to live a little bit further down the mountain. Bristlecones dominate the tree line. Instead, you have the limber pines leapfrogging the bristlecone pines. So instead of just sort of this nice, you know, ice cream sandwich shifting up the mountain, you're kind of getting different different arrangements, different frequencies of species. And so that's a great example of something we see in the fossil record as well. You see, instead of things just kind of maintaining their present arrangement and shifting north or upslope like this, you see kind of this scramble, and some species become common, others become rare, and it tends to look quite different.
All right. Let's see. Oh, I'm just going to read another really nice comment from Mary Tamar. Thank you so very much for bringing this topic to us and for the in-depth level from the author, Zach St. George. Looking forward to reading his book. Let's see. We have a lot of questions here. I'm just trying to figure out, is there a overlap, so I'm getting as many as I can. I think we have 27 questions here. Okay. Sorry, I'm taking so long here. Right. Okay. So Denise Louie talks about, I'm bringing us back to Monterey Pines, about Monterey Pines. She says, I think we have to acknowledge it's important to figure out negative impacts of moving plants around. Monterey Pine is considered invasive in San Francisco, where I live. My neighbor's Monterey Pine rains down needles, female cones, male cones, twigs, large branches, even bits of bark on my property, which I converted to a San Francisco native plant garden, and the pine is making the soil too acidic. So there's, we're getting to that issue of tree just a county north, two counties north of its native area in Monterey being considered invasive.
Yeah, I mean, you know, very broadly, people really care about the way things that are arranged, the way things are arranged in the present. We really like the suites of species that we see around us. We really see and value and really just like the ecosystems we have arranged the way they are. You know, so to see something come along like a Monterey Pine in the neighbor's yard, classic neighborly dispute. But you know, to have that ecosystem or have that bit of nature that we care about disrupted seemingly by something that doesn't belong, yeah, it is really painful and frustrating. And I think very broadly, you know, that's a great example of the kind of issue we're going to face over and over again as species, as forests, as all sorts of ecosystems change and are scrambled and rearranged by the changing climate. So at a certain point, I think we will have to accept a certain amount of change. I just, you know, I think we have to. In this specific case, the question of whether that specific Monterey Pine belongs, you know, that's between you and your neighbor.
We just have a couple minutes left, and so I'm gonna toss you one of the questions, which is really a writerly question, which is, what was the most challenging aspect of writing this book? Shahram asks.
Yeah, that's a good question. There was many challenging aspects. I think trying to realize what the central question was, because you know, the future of forests is very broad. We can see that we're facing really broad changes. We can see that the impact of humans moving species around has been really profound. So figuring out how to tell a coherent narrative challenged me. And it finally, again, I sort of realized that all of these questions are kind of unified and kind of go as like spokes off of the hub of, should we move trees north to save them? So that ended up being a good central line. That's
a great statement on which to wrap up our conversation. We're right at 5 o'clock. So Zach, thank you so much. Listeners, thank you for taking your time to join us in the afternoon. And please support Zach's efforts so he can go on to his next book or next Bay Nature feature by buying his book through Point Reyes Books. Support Bay Nature by subscribing. Again, you'll get an email with information about this talk and links if you need them to buy his book and subscribe. So thank you again, Zach. I really enjoyed talking to you.
I appreciate it.
Okay, take care.
Bye.